students, welcome back. This is Taurus, elbow bump. How are you? Are you doing okay? Is your family okay? Remember, if you need anything, please let me know. Shoot me an email, and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. So lucky you, you get to hear my voice for another lecture. But the best part is we will be learning about how to control for type 1 and type 2 errors. Yay! For the last few lectures, we have started to discuss null hypothesis statistical testing. Null hypothesis statistical testing is a formal approach to decide whether a statistical relationship in a sample actually reflects the real relationship in the population or if it's just due to chance. We start null hypothesis statistical testing by writing two hypotheses about the population parameter. The first statement that we write is called the null. It describes what's happening now if there was no difference. The alternative hypothesis is the one that reflects the question and what we would expect to see if the treatment or the change is actually occurring within the population. In the last video, we used the O.J. Simpson trial as an example. This example can be used for any trial that has a jury. What's unique about the O.J. Simpson trial is that he had two trials. He had a criminal trial and a civil trial. In both situations, the jury instructions were that Simpson should be assumed innocent. This is the null hypothesis. This is the status quo. The alternate hypothesis would be that if there is enough evidence to overturn the presumption of innocence, then you should reject the fact that he is innocent and actually take the alternate hypothesis that he is not innocent. Several things can happen with a jury trial. There are times where the jury could actually match the truth in what's happening, and there are times where they could get it wrong. In a jury trial, the jury won't know what the truth is. They can only go based on the evidence that is provided. From this, they will make a decision. Their null hypothesis is that the person is innocent. If the jury decides that there is not enough evidence to find that person guilty, to reject the fact that they're innocent, they're going to keep that statement. They're going to keep the null hypothesis that he is innocent. If the truth is that they are guilty and the jury decides that there is enough evidence that they can reject the null of innocence and assume the alternate hypothesis of guilty, then the truth matches the decision. So here in the situation with a jury trial, if they're innocent and the jury finds them innocent, then the truth matches the decision. If the truth is that they are guilty and the jury finds that there is enough evidence to reject the null of innocence, then the jury's decision matches the truth. What's important to remember here is that the truth is unknown. The only person that can really know for sure if they are innocent or guilty would be the defendant. Okay? So assuming that the jury does not have any idea what the truth is, which why would they? If they did, then they wouldn't be on the jury, but whatever. Then we could, then in these two situations, they would be correct. Now, two errors can be committed. In the situation with O.J. Simpson, a type 1 error would have been committed if the truth is that O.J. is innocent and the jury rejected the null of innocence and found him guilty. That is a type 1 error. If this error was committed in the O.J. Simpson scenario, then the second jury, the civil jury, the jury for the civil trial, would have committed a type 1 error. The other type of error that can happen is a type 2 error. That would happen if the truth was that O.J. was guilty and the jury found that he was innocent, that there was not enough information to reject the null of innocence, and they found him not guilty. This would be a type 2 error. This would have been the type of error that would have been committed in the criminal trial. In the justice system, a type 1 error is more egregious. It's worse to find an innocent person guilty than guilty person innocent, according to our laws. So we have to be very, very careful when committing type 1 errors in the jury system. So the question becomes, what are you willing to risk in committing a type 1 error? And you have to think about what are the repercussions of committing a type 1 error. So in criminal trials, they will have a saying beyond a reasonable doubt. 12 out of the 12 jurors must unanimously vote that the person is guilty. In this situation, the statistical equivalent would be setting the probability of being wrong at maybe 1,000th, meaning that they're willing to make a mistake 1 out of every 1,000 trials. Okay, which is still one too many, but it's got a very high threshold of proof. You need a lot of proof in order to actually reject the null and assume the person is guilty, because you could be committing a type 1 error. In the civil trials, there is not the need for beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury is instructed to look for the preponderance of evidence. In this situation, 9 out of the 12 jurors must vote guilty. So they're risking less on committing a type 1 error, right? Because it's not as serious. In the criminal trial, somebody could go to jail, somebody could get the death penalty. In the civil trial, it's still serious, but really they're just having to owe money, which is not a great thing, but they're not going to jail. Having to owe money is a lot better than having to go to jail or being on death row. In these situations, the statistical equivalent might be like a 10% of type 1 error risk, so that they're making a mistake once out of every 10 times. Deciding how much you want to risk in making a type 1 error is called the significance level. And what it is the probability of making a mistake rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis was actually true. So in other words, committing a type 1 error. You falsely rejected the null. The symbol for the significance level is the lowercase Greek alpha, which is this little thing that looks like a little fish, kind of. Deciding on the significance level, alpha, is really just a practical decision. There's no real rule of thumb. You just have to weigh a couple factors. If you set the alpha level too large, you risk committing a type 1 error. So if you set it at 10% alpha, you're going to be making a mistake 10 times out of every 100 times. If you set a 5% alpha, then you're going to make a mistake 5 out of every 100 times, approximately. That's what you're risking. If you set your alpha too small, then you risk committing a type 2 error, because you need so much proof in order to reject your null. So if you set the alpha at, say, 1,000th, that you want to risk committing a type 1 error 1 out of every 1,000 trials, that's how often you're willing to risk being incorrect, then you're going to need a lot of evidence. In this case, you risk committing a type 2 error. You risk retaining the null when in fact there was enough evidence to actually reject it. So what really boils down to is looking at what are the situations for your particular study and how serious the repercussions are for making an error. Is it someone's life that's at risk? Is it something that's kind of negligible? We want to reduce the error, but not to the point where we cannot find statistical significance. So here's a breakdown. If you've got a 0.01 alpha, you're willing to risk committing a type 1 error 1 time out of every 100 trials. If you have a 5% alpha, then you're willing to risk committing a type 1 error 5 times out of every 100 trials. And if you've got a 0.1% alpha, then you're willing to risk being wrong 10 times out of every 100 trials. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking at. Because we're trying to reduce error, right? We don't want to, because we're also trying to control for type 2 errors, falsely retaining the null, we have to make a decision here, okay? For most of the research that we do, especially the research that I do when it comes to educational type of research, then we usually use a 5% alpha. It's the most typical. If you're working with something like, say, medicine, medical studies will rarely use a 5% alpha. They might have a 0.01 alpha, so that they're making an error about 1% of the time, but it might be even smaller. It's not unusual to find medical trials that use a 0.001, 0.0001 alpha, because they really, really need a lot of proof to make sure that, say, a medicine is working before they use it on a whole lot of people. There's side effects to consider. There are allergies to consider, all kinds of things like that, that they really, really need to make sure that this medicine is actually being effective before they can make it widely available. When there's not a whole lot of issue with committing a type 1 error, maybe in studies that are just sort of anecdotal, everyday studies, nothing that there's a huge degree of risk involved, either harm to the person or harm to a group of people, or putting groups at a disadvantage, you might also see a 0.1 alpha, and that would be committing a type 1 error 10% of the time. So let's look at a couple examples. In this example, the ramifications of committing a type 1 error is very serious. So there's this new blood pressure medication called Drug A, and it's supposed to reduce blood pressure by more than 15 units of pressure. Okay, so apparently maybe that there's some existing medication that can already reduce blood pressure by these 15 units, and they want to know if this new drug will decrease it by more than 15 units, okay? So here is the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is just a reduction of 15, right? So they're expecting 15 units of a decrease. And the alternate is, if this thing is working, then we're going to see in the patients that are using this blood pressure more than 15 units of decrease. Okay, it's going to decrease by more than 15. So it says drug A can have serious side effects. So you don't want patients to use this medicine, to get on this medicine, unless it's actually lowering the average blood pressure of these patients by more than 15 units. So the implication of committing a type 1 error, falsely rejecting the null, saying that this medicine actually works, is that you would expose the patients to these serious side effects, and it's not helping them. So in this situation, you want to set your alpha pretty small. You want to only be wrong approximately, 1 out of every 10,000 trials. So because it's so serious, because it's affecting someone's life, you want the percentage of error to be very, very small. So you're going to need a whole lot of evidence in order to reject the null hypothesis in this situation. This is an example of when a type 1 error is not that big a deal. Okay, it's still important to control for error. It always is. We don't want to falsely reject the null ever, right? Type 1 error is never good, but there's times where it's not as serious. So in this situation, we're looking at grade inflation. And grade inflation is when students are given grades that don't necessarily reflect their mastery in the course. Okay, so the school wants to look to see if grade inflation is happening at their college. And they're saying that the average of GPA is 2.7 GPA. Okay, and they want to know if there has been grade inflation. So they want to know, has the average GPA increased to more than 2.7? So a type 1 error would really only claim that the GPA is more than 2.7 when it actually isn't. So the only thing that maybe can happen in these situations are the instructors are asked to grade more rigorously and the students may be unhappy. Okay, but it's not hurting anybody's health. Okay, it might raise your anxiety level, not gonna lie. It's gonna certainly raise mine, but there's no health risk involved. So in this situation, the type 1 error could be as high as 0.1, where they're really only making a mistake once out of every 10 trials, or 10 times out of every 100 trials. It's the same thing, but would probably be a little bit more reasonable to actually set it at a 0.05 alpha level when they're only making a mistake 5 out of every 100 trials, or they're willing to risk making a mistake every 5 times out of every 100 trials. So that's our alpha, the probability of committing a type 1 error. So the critical value is the z-score that marks the area or areas of the curve for the null hypothesis statistical testing decision making. It marks the point where the areas beyond the point are equal to the alpha that you selected. The critical value marks the point where the test statistic beyond that point is evidence that the likelihood of an event is unlikely due to just random chance. Let's look to see how this all kind of comes together. So in this photo, I want you to look at various parts. This line right here is the z-crit, okay? It marks a z-score. If here's our line, our normal curve has this line of z-scores right here that we've been working with, and this is a particular z-score. Everything beyond that is the alpha. So here, this line right here that I'm going to go ahead and mark in red is the z-crit, and all this gray area right here is the alpha. So this line marks where the alpha begins. So this right here is a one-tailed test. It's saying here is our z-crit. Everything beyond that is our alpha. Let's say our alpha was 5%. This is the line right here for this one-tailed test that's saying this is the line where everything beyond this is 5% of the curve. If this was a 10% alpha, then the z-crit would be the z-score that marked everything beyond that would be 10% of the curve. Okay, so it's really a line of demarcation where everything beyond that marks the alpha. The alpha is all this gray area. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is the test statistic. The test statistic is the z-score that comes from the experiment, that comes from the sample that we just investigated. And it tells us how unlikely a sample proportion could have happened by random chance had the null hypothesis actually been true. If the null hypothesis is true, then the test statistic is going to be very close to zero, close to the center of the curve. The farther away the test statistic is from the middle of the curve, the more likely that you will reject the null hypothesis. We compare our test statistic for our sample with the z-crit, or the critical value. If there is no change from the state of the null hypothesis, then we would expect our z-score to be close to the center, close to the z-score of 0. But the farther away the test statistic is from the z-score of 0 is more evidence that we can reject the null, that there is a difference, and that the evidence supports the alternative hypothesis. Let's look at this again. So here we have what we just talked about. This line right here is our z-crit, okay? And the gray is our alpha. We saw that in the last slide. Here, the test statistic, the z-score for the sample, is beyond the z-crit. It is within the area of the alpha, okay? This is saying we expect, if there's no difference between our null and our sample, we should get something that exists over here in this area. The z-crit we're saying any z-scores that we obtain beyond our z-crit, we're going to go ahead and reject. The alpha is the probability that we've set, and the one that we use to establish that z-crit. So the z-crit is the line that separates the alpha from the rest of the curve. Here, we got a test statistic that is beyond our z-crit, and any probability beyond the test statistic is what we consider the p-value. It is the probability of obtaining that z-score. So how do we calculate the test statistic? The test statistic just has the same formula that we've been using for any other z-score. First, you need a normal curve. If you don't have a normal curve, none of this matters. Okay, so you have to check for the assumption of normality. Then you're going to take your observed value, you're going to subtract your null value from that, and divide by your standard error. If you're working with proportions, then you're going to use the same z-score formula that we worked with proportions and the standard error formula to figure out our denominator here. The p-hat is the sample proportion from your data, and the p-naught is the proportion that you used to create your null hypothesis. So your p-value is the probability that if your experiment were repeated, you would get that same test statistic or one more extreme than the one you actually got. If you have a very small p-value, that suggests that you have something that is absolutely very rare, and it's enough evidence that you can reject the null. So let's look at our diagram again. Here we have the z-crit. It is the line that marks off where values have to surpass, where the test statistic has to surpass in order for there to be enough evidence to reject the null. The z-crit marks the area where the alpha begins. Okay, so the z-crit is this red, the alpha is this gray that's back here kind of hidden. The test statistic is the z-score for your experiment, for your sample. If that test statistic goes beyond the z-crit, then you can reject the null hypothesis. The p-value is this striped area in here. That is the probability of obtaining your test statistic. So your test statistic has to surpass your z-crit, and your p-value has to be smaller than your alpha. These two things should happen together each time. If that doesn't happen, if your test statistic surpasses your z-crit, but your p-value is still bigger than your alpha, then something's wrong, because you should always have the same thing. It should always match. Either your test statistic surpasses your z-crit and your p-value is smaller than your alpha, or your test statistic does not surpass your z-crit and your p-value is not smaller than your alpha. Okay? If the first is true, that your t-statistic surpasses your z-crit and your p-value is smaller than your alpha, this is sufficient evidence that you can reject the null hypothesis of no difference. We've just spent a lot of time talking about how to control for type 1 error. Let's briefly talk about type 2 error and how to control for committing a type 2 error. If you recall, a type 2 error is when we retain the null when the null hypothesis was actually false. In other words, there was something happening in the treatment, but we were unable to detect it. So the power of a hypothesis test describes its ability to identify an effect if there is an effect to be found. We always want to strive for large power, and the easiest way to do this is just to increase the sample size. Increasing the sample size pretty much fixes everything, because closer and closer to the population brings us closer and closer to the truth. Increasing the level of significance automatically decreases the power, because if your level of significance is too small, you might not be able to reject anything. If you want a better chance of rejecting the null when the null is false, you can decrease the level of significance, but then you risk committing a type 1 error. The only way that you can fix it, meaning having large power and also having a large level of significance, so you can avoid either type of error, either type 1 or type 2 error, is to have a large sample size. So what's the big idea? Today's big idea is that when decisions are made about which hypothesis is supported, the researcher can be either correct or incorrect. If the researcher's decision matches the truth, no error has been made. However, if the truth does not match the decision, there are two possible types of errors, type 1 and type 2 errors. Researchers have to decide how much they're willing to risk committing a type 1 error, and they do this by describing their level of significance. The line which marks where the level of significance alpha begins is called the critical value. If you're working with z-scores, it's called the z-crit. If you're working with z-scores, the test statistic is the z-score of the results, and the p-value is the probability of obtaining that test statistic if you were to repeat the experiment. So that's it for today. With that said, don't forget to check your emails, check Blackboard, do your homework, and subscribe to this channel. Even better, hit that notification bell so you know when there are new videos for this course. Okay? This is your teacher, Torres, saying stay safe, and I will be waiting to give you a virtual elbow bump in the next video. Ciao!